to The Last Hike. Today I'm going to uncover the Death Valley hike, where two gym influencers believed years of training had prepared them for conditions even park rangers refused to enter. Trusting their bodies more than the people who worked there convinced them to treat the rangers' warning as part of the challenge. Knowing how this story ends, it's unsettling how the rangers saw the danger long before they did. It was July 14th, 2022. Across the Furnace Creek Basin in Death Valley National Park, conditions were already shaping up to be one of the park's most dangerous midsummer heat events. Later that day, Augustus Hargrove and Cypress Pelletier planned to film near Devil's Golf Course, where exposed salt flats and dark mineral surfaces would absorb hours of direct sunlight before they ever stepped onto them. Now, one of the men was Augustus Hargrove. He was 29 years old and worked as an independent personal trainer and fitness content creator based in Phoenix, Arizona. His online content centered on extreme conditioning, featuring desert runs, loaded hikes, sauna sessions, and other endurance challenges. The message behind it was simple: deliberately embracing physical discomfort could build superior resilience. He stood 5 feet 11 with a heavily muscular build. He'd completed several desert endurance events, trained regularly through Arizona summers, and had never experienced a significant heat-related illness. So, to him, those experiences reinforced the same belief over and over again that disciplined preparation allowed him to perform safely in environments most people considered hazardous. Every time he walked away from something like that without getting hurt, it just stacked another layer onto the same conclusion. Then there was Cypress Pelletier. He was 31 years old and worked as an online fitness coach and supplement ambassador based in Scottsdale, Arizona. His content focused on performance, recovery, and heat adaptation, and he often pointed to research on sauna training as evidence that repeated heat exposure improved tolerance in extreme environments. Pelletier stood 6 feet 1 with substantial lean muscle mass, and like Hargrove, he had no history of heat stroke or any other serious exertional illness. Frequent sauna sessions were a central part of his training routine, and after years of doing them, they gave him real confidence that the conditioning he'd built would translate directly to the desert. He wasn't guessing, he genuinely believed the science backed him up, and that's actually what makes this harder to sit with. The two men had spent several weeks planning a collaborative video centered on a simple premise: completing a strenuous midday hike in Death Valley National Park at the hottest point of the day. They chose the location and timing deliberately, believing the extreme conditions would create dramatic visuals, while reinforcing their message that elite conditioning allowed them to perform where others could not. Their preparation focused largely on fitness rather than the specific environmental hazards of Death Valley. Both drew confidence from years of legitimate desert training in Arizona, assuming the park presented a more intense version of conditions they already understood. What they failed to recognize was that the Furnace Creek Basin in mid-July creates a combination of radiant heat, ground temperatures, and prolonged exposure that differs fundamentally from the environments in which they had built that confidence. The comparison was understandable but incomplete. Much of their desert training had taken place around Phoenix, where routes typically remained close to roads, neighborhoods, or trailheads, allowing them to end a workout, return to an air-conditioned vehicle, or seek shelter if conditions became more severe than expected. Even during periods of extreme heat, the environment generally provided frequent opportunities to reduce exposure before it progressed into a medical emergency. That safety net was so built into everything they'd ever done out there that I don't think either of them even noticed it was there. The terrain they planned to cross in Death Valley offered far fewer of those safeguards. Once they left the parking area, they entered an open basin with virtually no natural shade, no reliable source of cooling, and limited options for rapidly ending the hike without retracing their steps across the same exposed ground. Every additional minute spent walking increased the total amount of heat absorbed by the body. Unlike a structured training session, where intensity could be reduced or the workout stopped at any time, the return journey required continued movement through the same conditions that had already begun overwhelming their ability to regulate core temperature. That difference actually started with the ground itself. See, a lot of the exposed terrain around the Furnace Creek Basin sits below sea level. It's made up of packed salt clay, dark mineral deposits, and exposed rock that soak up huge amounts of sunlight all morning long. And by the middle of the day in July, those surfaces don't just get hot, they become much hotter than the surrounding air. The forecast the two men had looked at was based on the shaded air temperature, not the much higher heat radiating off the ground they were planning to walk across. I keep coming back to that. They checked the forecast, they did that part, and it still gave them a completely wrong picture of what they were walking into. And that's a really important difference. Walking across terrain like that meant their bodies were taking in heat from below, through the ground, from above, through direct sunlight, and from the surrounding air all at the same time. It created a combined thermal load that was far greater than the air temperature alone would suggest. Both men genuinely understood hot weather training, but they had never actually experienced that combination of heat in the Furnace Creek Basin. That's the part they didn't realize was different. Relative humidity that day was extremely low, so sweat evaporated almost immediately. Normally that would help cool the body, but here it also meant they stayed relatively dry on the surface while still losing fluids faster than they realized. Coming from Arizona's dry heat, neither man read that as a warning sign. Dry skin in dry heat? To them, that probably just felt like Tuesday. A light breeze did little to help. Once the air itself became extremely hot, moving air stopped providing meaningful cooling and instead just added to the overall heat load they were carrying. Their gear added to the strain. Both wore compression clothing meant for performance and support, but in that kind of heat, it trapped warmth against the skin and reduced heat loss. They each carried a 3-liter hydration pack with electrolytes, which they were used to relying on in desert training. But under the pace they were filming at, in those conditions, they were likely losing fluids faster than they could replace them, and the water supply wasn't going to last as long as they expected. The last factor was probably the one both men trusted the most. In fact, they saw it as their biggest advantage. Both of them had spent years building lean muscle, and it had become a huge part of who they were. It was central to their careers, their training, and the image they shared online. And in almost every athletic setting, that kind of muscle was a real advantage. It meant more strength, better endurance, and a greater ability to handle hard physical work. But in extreme heat, that same muscle came with a downside. The more muscle you have, the more metabolic heat your body produces during exertion. And once you combine that with intense sunlight, superheated ground, and extremely hot air, the body can only get rid of heat so fast. Their core temperatures began rising much faster than either man expected. It's a relationship that's well documented in heat physiology, but it wasn't something either of them had ever really factored into the way they understood heat training. The thing they'd spent years building, the thing their whole identity was wrapped around, was working directly against them out there. Pelletier's confidence was also reinforced by years of regular sauna training, which he saw as preparation for extreme desert heat. But there was one really important difference. In a sauna, you're mostly sitting still in a controlled environment. Out here, they were hiking across Death Valley under direct sunlight while walking on ground that was radiating enormous amounts of heat back into their bodies. Regular sauna sessions can absolutely improve the body's response to heat, but those adaptations have limits. They can't fully compensate when the heat coming from the environment, combined with the heat your own body is producing, exceeds your body's ability to cool itself. Those were the environmental, physiological, and logistical conditions as the two men arrived at Furnace Creek on the morning of July 14th, 2022. The Furnace Creek Visitor Center parking lot sits at the edge of the basin, with pavement, low buildings, and open desert beyond. The air was already unusually hot, but familiar enough for both men after years of training in Arizona, so it didn't feel out of the ordinary. They began filming almost immediately. Early footage later reviewed by investigators shows them setting up shots, discussing the plan, and adjusting gear while moving around the parking area. They appeared comfortable, and the heat mainly reinforced their belief that the conditions were manageable. Watching footage of people who have no idea what's coming is one of the stranger parts of working through cases like this. After spending more than an hour filming around the visitor area, the two men eventually walked into the visitor center to ask about getting to the location where they planned to shoot their video. As the ranger on duty listened to their plan, one thing immediately caught his attention: they wanted to begin crossing the exposed flats around noon. The ranger immediately advised against it and made clear that park staff could not recommend or support the route under those conditions. According to the later investigation, he explained just how dangerous the Furnace Creek Basin becomes in the middle of the day, then stepped outside with a handheld infrared thermometer and pointed it at the exposed pavement. Even though it was still morning, the reading showed the ground was already much hotter than the surrounding air. And it was only going to keep getting hotter as the sun climbed higher. He didn't just tell them, he put a number in front of their faces, right there on the thermometer, and they still didn't move. The ranger also started asking a few more questions. He wanted to know how much water they were carrying, whether they had a satellite communicator or any other way to call for help, how far they planned to travel from the access road, and if either of them had actually hiked in Death Valley during the middle of summer before. Their answers made it clear they had plenty of experience training in Arizona deserts, but very little experience with the specific conditions inside the Furnace Creek Basin. The ranger explained that desert fitness and experience were valuable, but they didn't automatically prepare someone for Death Valley during the hottest part of the year. He also recommended beginning any strenuous activity shortly after sunrise or postponing the hike until late afternoon, when the thermal load on the body would be substantially lower. The two men declined to alter their production schedule, explaining that the video depended on filming under the harshest midday light. The ranger made it clear that he would not help plan, endorse, or support the route under those conditions. In his judgment, the environmental risk was simply too high. His warning was not based on their physical fitness, but on the conditions they intended to enter. A man whose entire job involved working in that environment looked at those conditions and decided they were not worth the risk. A man whose entire job is working in that environment looked at those conditions and said he wouldn't go out there himself. And somehow that still didn't land. Both men acknowledged the demonstration, and they even recorded part of the conversation on camera. But instead of taking it as a reason to rethink their plan, they seemed to see it as proof that the challenge was exactly what they had hoped it would be. In a way, the Ranger's warning reinforced the story they wanted to tell. Before leaving the visitor center, the Ranger documented that they had been warned about the heat, advised not to begin during the midday period, and declined a written heat safety handout. After leaving the visitor center, the two men drove south toward Devil's Golf Course. The location was exactly what they wanted for the video: a vast expanse of exposed salt formations, mineral-stained ground, and visible heat shimmer stretching across the basin. They parked near the access road and spent the remainder of the morning preparing equipment and filming sponsor content while waiting for the hottest part of the day. Instead of getting an early start, Hargrove and Pelletier spent the rest of the morning near their vehicle. Later, when investigators reviewed the footage from their cameras, it became clear that this wasn't a delay or a last-minute decision. It was part of the plan from the beginning. They wanted to start filming under the harshest midday sunlight because they believed it would create the most dramatic visuals for their audience. During the wait, they filmed sponsor content, reviewed gear, and stayed inside the air-conditioned SUV between takes. They drank electrolyte beverages but ate very little, entering the hike feeling rested and confident that they had prepared appropriately. Shortly before midday, they left the vehicle and began crossing the exposed salt clay flats they had chosen for the challenge. There was no established trail. The goal was simply to travel across the open terrain while filming under the harshest possible midday conditions. They walked out of an air-conditioned car into 120-degree heat and started filming. That transition alone is staggering to me. By the time they left the parking area, exposed ground surfaces had already reached temperatures far exceeding the surrounding air. The salt clay flats and dark rock had absorbed hours of direct sunlight, producing the visible heat shimmer the two men had intentionally chosen as the backdrop for their video. They filmed continuously as they walked, with Hargrove using a handheld gimbal and Pelletier wearing a chest-mounted camera, maintaining a steady pace across the open terrain. For the first several minutes, everything appeared to be going exactly as they had planned. Both men walked at a comfortable pace, taking turns filming one another while occasionally stopping to reposition the cameras for wider shots across the basin. They spoke comfortably, reviewed a few clips on their screens, and continued moving without any obvious signs of difficulty. As they moved farther away from the parking area, the stops became a little more frequent. Sometimes it was to frame another shot, other times to wipe dust from a camera lens or check that the equipment was still recording properly. Neither stop lasted very long, and both men treated them as part of the filming process rather than a response to the heat. After another several minutes, both began reaching for their hydration packs more often than they had during the opening part of the hike. They took longer drinks between filming segments, and recovered footage later showed Hargrove briefly commenting on how surprisingly warm the water had already become after sitting in the sun. Even so, neither suggested turning back, and they continued following the route they had planned. The heat from the ground also became harder to ignore. At one point, Hargrove briefly lifted one foot after stopping to adjust the gimbal, while Pelletier looked down at the surface before continuing forward. Neither appeared alarmed, but investigators later noted that both men were spending more time standing still whenever they paused, as if unconsciously trying to recover before walking again. Their filming also became less fluid than it had been near the visitor center. Small interruptions that normally would have taken only a few seconds checking battery levels, cleaning lenses, adjusting camera mounts, or reviewing footage began happening more often. None of those actions seemed unusual by themselves, but together they suggested that the physical effort of simply remaining in the environment was beginning to compete with the attention they had originally devoted to producing the video. Both wore lightweight running shoes with breathable mesh uppers, a practical choice for many desert trails, but less suited to the extreme radiant heat beneath their feet. While the shoes protected them from direct contact with the ground, they offered limited insulation from the intense heat rising from the surface with every step. Approximately 25 minutes into the terrain segment, a family visiting from Oregon later reported seeing two men filming in the open basin. They described both as muscular and athletic, but recalled that one of them stopped repeatedly to rest despite appearing exceptionally fit. At the time, nothing about the scene seemed unusual enough to warrant intervention.
They looked so capable from the outside that nobody thought to worry. That's a detail I can't stop thinking about.
After they left the access road, no ranger witnessed every moment of the challenge. The final sequence was reconstructed from recovered camera footage, visitor photographs, emergency call records, ranger documentation, medical findings, and witness statements from people who saw the two men on the flats that afternoon. Footage recovered from Hargrove's camera shows the first subtle signs of physical decline. His walking became slightly uneven, with a few brief balance corrections on otherwise flat ground. Neither man commented on it, and filming continued. As investigators reviewed the recordings, they noted a gradual shift in pace and rhythm. Conversations became shorter, with longer pauses, and their breathing grew more audible, even between comments. The camera was also adjusted more often as Hargrove lowered it between shots. Overall, the filming became less steady and more fragmented. They paused more frequently to adjust gear or hydration packs, and several clips ended or drifted off framing before being corrected. Investigators later viewed these changes as early signs that heat stress was beginning to affect focus, coordination, and consistency. By the time they'd walked only about 0.6 of a mile, it had gotten incredibly hot. The air was already well over 120 degrees, and the ground under their feet was even hotter than that. Their hydration packs had also been baking in the sun for close to an hour, so the water inside was warm by then. They could still drink it, and they did, but it just didn't help cool them down the way cold or even cool water normally would.
0.6 of a mile. That's less than 7 minutes of walking at a normal pace, and they were already in serious trouble.
Footage from Pelletier's chest-mounted camera captured another early warning sign as he reached to adjust a lens cap. His hands displayed a fine, persistent tremor that was noticeable in close-up footage, though he showed no reaction and continued filming. Around the same time, Hargrove was seen pouring water over his forearms in an effort to cool himself. It was a legitimate field technique, but under the combined effects of extreme air temperature, radiant ground heat, and sustained exertion, it offered only limited relief. As they continued across the basin, Pelletier gradually drifted away from their intended route. Hargrove redirected him, and he corrected course without hesitation or any apparent awareness that he had begun wandering. Investigators later noted that this type of subtle directional drift is consistent with the early neurological effects of rising core body temperature, when heat-related cognitive impairment begins before the affected person recognizes that anything is wrong.
He didn't know he was drifting. That's the part that gets me. He was already being affected and had no idea.
As they kept moving across the open basin, Hargrove suddenly stumbled on completely flat ground. There wasn't a rock or any obvious obstacle in front of him. He caught himself on one knee, paused for a moment, then got back up. A family watching from a nearby roadside pull-off noticed it. While they were taking pictures of the landscape, they happened to capture a photo that would later help investigators piece together the timeline leading up to the emergency. After that stumble, something else changed. Hargrove's handheld camera was either set down or slipped from his hand, and it just kept recording from ground level. The footage showed the lower legs of both men, the heat shimmering off the ground, and the sky stretching out above them. Nobody said they were done filming, and there was no sign that the camera had been placed there on purpose. It simply stayed where it landed as everything that followed unfolded.
There's just something about footage that just keeps running after the person holding it can't anymore that I find genuinely hard to watch.
The first collapse occurred shortly after noon. Hargrove did not fall forward. He sat down abruptly near a low basalt outcrop about 2/3 of a mile from the access road, with no visible attempt to ease himself into a resting position. The dark mineral surface beneath him had been absorbing direct sunlight for hours and was radiating intense heat. Instead of cooling him, sitting on the ground added to his already overwhelming thermal load. He never stood again. When Pelletier saw Hargrove go down, he started moving toward a shallow rock shadow about 40 feet away. It was probably the closest bit of shade he could see, but he never made it. About halfway there, he began losing coordination. First, he dropped to his hands and knees, and then he rolled onto his side. Investigators later concluded that the way he came to rest was consistent with someone who had tried to catch themselves during a fall, but no longer had enough muscular control to do it. At that point, both men were on the ground in the middle of the exposed basin. The air temperature was already above 120 degrees, and the ground beneath them was even hotter. Their phones were still in their gear and within reach, but severe hyperthermia can quickly affect both fine motor control and clear thinking. Even something as simple as pulling out a phone, unlocking it, and making a call can become incredibly difficult. Investigators later concluded that both men had likely reached core temperatures where they were no longer able to carry out those steps reliably, even if they knew they were in serious danger. The Oregon family, watching from a nearby roadside pull-off, called emergency services after observing observing the two men remain motionless for several minutes. Additional visitors on the access road reported the emergency shortly afterward, prompting the park's emergency response. Emergency response in the Furnace Creek Basin during periods of extreme heat operates under strict safety protocols. Rangers and EMS personnel limit their time on exposed terrain, work in pairs, and rotate through air-conditioned vehicles because the same conditions that endanger visitors also threaten rescuers.
The people going in to help them needed a rotation schedule just to survive the same ground those two men walked out onto voluntarily.
First responders reached the two men about 27 minutes after the initial emergency services call. Both were unresponsive and showed signs consistent with severe hyperthermia. They were transported to the nearest road access point before being airlifted to a regional trauma center, but neither regained consciousness. Augustus Hargrove was pronounced dead later that afternoon. Cypress Pelletier died a short time afterward. The local coroner's office determined that both men died from hyperthermia with multi-organ failure. Their core body temperatures had risen to levels that caused irreversible damage to the brain, cardiovascular system, and other vital organs before definitive medical treatment could be provided. Both examinations also found evidence of rhabdomyolysis, a condition in which severely stressed muscle tissue breaks down and releases proteins into the bloodstream, placing additional strain on the kidneys. Investigators found no underlying medical conditions that contributed to either death, concluding that both fatalities resulted from extreme environmental heat combined with physical exertion.
The muscle tissue itself was breaking down. Their own bodies became part of what killed them.
The investigative review classified the incident as preventable. Its internal review identified three primary contributing factors: disregarding ranger safety guidance, deliberately choosing to begin the hike during the day's most dangerous heat for filming purposes, and overestimating the protection offered by previous heat training in environments that differed fundamentally from Death Valley's extreme radiant heat. The rangers' contemporaneous log documenting that they had been warned about the heat, advised not to begin at midday, and declined a written heat safety handout was included in the review as part of the incident record.